The dust cloud on the horizon told Jacob everything he needed to know. His last 20 head of cattle were gone, stolen in the night by rustlers who knew a desperate man when they saw one. Standing there in the morning sun, watching that dust fade into nothing, Jacob faced a choice that would change his life forever. He could give up the ranch his father built, or he could ride into Apache territory and make a deal no white man had ever made before. What he didn't know was that the price for survival would be a wife he never wanted, and a lesson about pride that would save them both. Jacob had been a cattleman all his life. His father taught him everything about raising longhorns on the harsh Texas borderlands. But the summer of 1882 had been brutal. The creek that fed his land dried to dust in May. The grass turned brown and brittle. One by one his cattle dropped dead or wandered off searching for water. Now, with the last of them stolen, he had nothing left but stubborn pride and a wild idea. 3 days earlier, a traveling merchant had stopped at his ranch for water. The man spoke of an Apache band living 2 days' ride south, near the Mexican border. They had cattle, he said, good strong animals that survived where others died. The Apache had learned to move them between hidden springs and valleys where grass still grew. Most men would rather lose everything than trade with Apache. But Jacob wasn't most men anymore. Desperation had burned away his prejudice, leaving only the need to survive. The morning he set out, his nearest neighbor Tom tried to stop him. Tom said the Apache would kill him on sight, said no white man who rode into their territory ever came back the same, if they came back at all. Jacob loaded his rifle anyway. He had no money to offer, but he had tools, ammunition, and his father's gold pocket watch. Maybe it would be enough. The ride south took him through country that grew stranger with each mile. The familiar cattle trails disappeared. Red rocks rose from the earth like ancient bones. By the second day, he knew he was being watched. He could feel eyes on him from the ridges above, but no one stopped him. When he finally reached the Apache camp, nestled in a valley he never would have found alone, 20 warriors were waiting. The chief was a man named Samuel, though Jacob doubted that was his birth name. Samuel spoke English better than some cowboys Jacob knew. He wore traditional Apache clothing, but carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen both worlds and chosen his own path. When Jacob explained what he wanted, Samuel didn't laugh. He didn't threaten. He simply shook his head. The tools meant nothing to them. They had their own. The ammunition was wrong for their rifles. The gold watch made Samuel smile, but not in a way that gave Jacob hope. Then Samuel said something that changed everything. He had a daughter named Nita. She was 23 summers old, strong as any man, and refused every match her father suggested. She could ride, shoot, and knew the old ways of finding water and food, where others saw only desert, but she had a temper like a thunderstorm and no patience for foolish men. Samuel offered a trade that left Jacob speechless. Take Nita as his wife, and he could have 30 head of cattle, good strong animals that knew how to survive. The marriage would be real, blessed by both Apache tradition and whatever Christian ceremony Jacob wanted. It would create a bond between Samuel's people and the white settlements, maybe enough to prevent more bloodshed. But Jacob had to decide now, and Nita had to agree. When they brought Nita out, Jacob understood why no Apache man had won her hand. She was beautiful in a fierce way, with eyes that looked right through him. Her hair was long and black as midnight. She wore a duskin dress decorated with beads, but her stance was that of a warrior. When her father explained the proposal, she looked at Jacob like he was something stuck to her shoe. The argument between Nita and her father lasted an hour. Jacob didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She gestured at him with obvious disgust. Samuel remained calm, speaking in low tones that seemed to make his daughter angrier. Finally, she walked up to Jacob, looked him up and down, and said in perfect English that he would probably be dead within a month anyway. Then she agreed. The wedding happened that afternoon. It was nothing like Jacob had imagined his wedding would be, back when he thought he would marry the baker's daughter from town. There were Apache blessings he didn't understand, smoke from sacred herbs that made his eyes water, and vows that Nita translated with obvious reluctance. When it was done, Samuel's people gave them the cattle as promised. They also gave them supplies for the journey back, though Nita packed these herself, clearly not trusting Jacob to know what they would need. The ride back to Jacob's ranch took 4 days. Nita refused to speak to him beyond basic necessities. She rode her own horse, a painted mare that seemed to understand her thoughts. At night, she made her own camp 20 feet from his. She knew how to move the cattle better than he did, using calls and whistles he had never heard. When they finally reached his ranch, she looked at the simple wooden house and the dry land around it and shook her head. The first weeks were terrible. Jacob's few neighbors heard about his Apache wife within days. Some refused to speak to him anymore. Others came by to stare at Nita like she was a circus animal. She spent most of her time outside, setting up a shelter made of branches and hides near the main house, but not in it. She cooked her own food over an open fire, even though Jacob had a wood stove inside. But slowly things began to change. Nita started exploring the land around the ranch. She found things Jacob had never noticed in 15 years. A seep of water hidden behind rocks that could be opened up into a spring. Plants that could survive the drought and provide food for the cattle. She showed him how to read the sky for weather changes days in advance. At first, Jacob ignored her suggestions. He had been ranching all his life. What could she know that he didn't? But when she predicted a flash flood 3 days before it happened and moved the cattle to higher ground against his orders, saving them all, he started to listen. She taught him to see the land differently, not as something to fight against, but something to work with. The real test came in September. Jacob woke to the smell of smoke. A grass fire was racing toward the ranch from the west, driven by winds that would push it straight through his property. In normal times, with green grass, it might not have been deadly, but with everything dried out, it would destroy everything. His house, his barn, the cattle, everything would be gone. Jacob grabbed buckets and started hauling water from the well, knowing it was useless. The fire was too big, moving too fast. He was preparing to release the cattle and hope some survived when Nita stopped him. She had a different plan. Using controlled burns, something her people had done for generations, they could create a firebreak. But they had to work together, and he had to trust her completely. What followed was the longest day of Jacob's life. Nita directed him with sharp commands, no longer the silent woman who had ridden beside him. She knew exactly where to set the controlled burns, how to use the wind patterns and the shape of the land to their advantage. She had him dig trenches in places that seemed random, but created natural barriers. When the main fire reached them that evening, it hit the blackened ground where their controlled burns had eaten up all the fuel. It tried to jump the trenches, but couldn't. It split around the ranch like water around a stone. As they stood there covered in soot and ash, watching the fire burn itself out against their defenses, Jacob finally saw Nita for who she really was. Not a burden he had taken on, not a strange woman from a different world, but someone whose knowledge and strength had saved everything he cared about. When he turned to thank her, really thank her for the first time, she was already walking away. That night, she cooked dinner inside the house for the first time. They ate together in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the cold distance of strangers forced together, but the quiet understanding of partners who had faced danger and survived. When she spoke, it was to tell him about other things her people knew, how to preserve meat without salt, how to predict weather months in advance, how to doctor sick cattle with plants that grew wild all around them. Over the following months, their marriage became real in ways neither had expected. Jacob learned some Apache words, enough to make Nita laugh at his terrible pronunciation. She improved the ranch in countless small ways, from better water management to new sources of food during lean times. The neighbors who had shunned them began coming around when they saw how the ranch prospered despite the continuing drought. By spring, new calves were being born. The herd was growing. The water sources Nita had found were holding steady. Jacob had learned to blend her Apache methods with his own ranching knowledge, creating something stronger than either approach alone. They still argued sometimes, usually about his stubborn pride or her fierce independence. But now those arguments ended with understanding instead of silence. One morning, as they worked together to birth a difficult calf, Jacob realized something had changed inside him. The woman he had married out of desperation had become the partner he couldn't imagine living without. When he told her this, clumsily and with too many words, she simply smiled and said she knew. She had known since the day of the fire, when he trusted her enough to follow her lead without question. Their story spread through the territory. The white rancher who married an Apache woman and prospered when others failed. Some people called it scandal, others called it smart. But for Jacob and Nita, it was simply their life. Two different worlds finding common ground in the harsh beauty of the borderlands. They had started as strangers bound by desperate necessity. They became partners united by respect. And in the end, they became something neither had expected when he rode into Apache land for cattle and rode out with a wife. The ranch grew over the years. Other families, both white and Apache, began to settle nearby, creating a community that hadn't existed before. Jacob and Nita's children grew up speaking both languages, knowing both traditions. They could track like Apache and ranch like cowboys. They were proof that different peoples could build something together that was stronger than what either could build alone. Looking back, Jacob often thought about that morning when he stood watching his stolen cattle disappear into dust. He had thought it was the end of everything, but it had been a beginning. Sometimes the thing we need most comes in a form we never expect. He had ridden into Apache territory looking for cattle to save his ranch. He had found Nita, who saved not just his ranch but his whole understanding of what was possible when pride gives way to partnership and prejudice gives way to respect. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales from the Old West, where courage prevails and justice is served. Share your thoughts in the comments about what moved you most in this story. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below, and don't forget to check out our other Western tales in the playlist.